Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. My name is Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm your host today. And my co-host here is Dr. Daniel Binus. I should have just let you speak for yourself.
That's okay.
What do you
do,
Dr. Binus? Tell us what you do.
I'm a psychiatrist, and I love what I do.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking about victim versus victor mentality, and we hope you'll get a lot out of it. So let's start. And my first question is, every good presentation starts with, let's define what victim and victor are. So
Yes.
What's a victim?
Okay, so when we're talking about a victim mentality, we're really talking about someone that tends to blame their circumstances, having this kind of blaming mindset, and what we call in psychology an external locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what that has to do with is the sense of like, okay, my circumstances, maybe it's other people or things that are happening in my life, they're really to blame for my mental health, for my bad job, for my bad teeth, for, my unruly dog and everything else in my life. So it's kind of like this, oh man, life is just happening to me and I can't do anything about it.
So like everything outside of me is the problem, not me.
Exactly.
And there's nothing, I'm not the problem.
Exactly.
Everything outside of me.
And I can't really do anything about it.
Oh yeah, I'm handicapped to my circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay, so if that's the victim, then what is the victor mentality? What's that? What's the definition of that?
Yeah. So basically, the victor mentality is the opposite. So that is somebody that another way that term that we often use is an ownership mentality, where they take ownership of their life. They say, you know what, I can't control everything around me, but I can control how I respond to that. And so it's this sense, what we call in psychology, instead of external locus of control, internal locus of control. Like I can't control everything in my life, but I can control my response. And so this sense of like, okay, I'm going to take responsibility for my life, even though I can't control everything happening to me.
Okay, so internally, locus of control.
That's right.
So focusing on what I can do about the things that are happening externally.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Cool. So then let's get a little deeper with the victim part, because some people might want to figure out if they are more identifying with the victim. So what are some of the symptoms of like a victim?
Yeah. So some of the common symptoms, and I think you could probably speak to this very well as a therapist, but constantly blaming other people or circumstances, having this mentality of like life is against me. And, it kind of reminds me of one individual that I talked to, and they said that their father, he was very depressed himself. And he said, life is like a bowl of cherries. It's full of pits.
And cherries.
And cherries, right? But just kind of like this negative, pessimistic outlook, reliving painful memories and almost relishing in that. That's a symptom. In other words, like saying, oh man, this is, it just was terrible, what happened in my childhood, or it was terrible what happened. And it might be, but continuing to recount those terrible experiences, or did you see the way that person treated me? It was just terrible. And it's one thing to mention it and then move on, but they keep bringing it up. And
it's almost like romanticizing it. Like, oh, this, tragic thing, but let me tell you the story and let me go over it again and again. And sometimes we call that perseveration, where we just keep talking about the same things. And it'd be nice if they talked about good things, but in this case, it sounds like they're all negative
Right.
things. Like, let
It's
me tell you every bad negative thing that's
negative
happened.
perseveration, feeling
Mhm.
sorry for yourself. And in a way, kind of using that to attract people to feel sorry for yourself and get attention. And that's
Mhm.
often, a big benefit. Like one of the big symptoms of victimhood is like, okay, I derive benefit somehow from being a victim because I'm going to
Mhm.
get help and I'm going to get attention and my love needs. And so the more sorry I can get people to feel for me, that the more I'm going to get some of those needs met. Now, I will say, a lot of people, this can be very much learned behavior, and it's
Mhm.
not like they're purposely like wanting to be victims. And so,
Yeah.
if you're some of these things are resonating with you as our listeners, I don't want you to feel judged or criticized. It's just like, okay, this might be the best way that you've learned to cope so far, but I'm hoping that you start realizing through this podcast there's better ways.
Yeah, and a lot of things we don't realize we're learning. I talk to people all the time about this. Like, I don't recognize there's something wrong with what I'm thinking or how I'm thinking because I've never gone in somebody else's brain to see how they think. So this is kind of just helping people become aware of maybe where their victim symptoms might
That's
be.
right. Yeah, and I'm curious too, and I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but just as a therapist, obviously there's got to be some secondary benefit, right? I mean, in your
Mhm.
experience, what do you think? Why do you think people kind of have this learned behavior and fall into this victim trap? Because obviously, if there wasn't benefit, people wouldn't keep doing it, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed in that victim mentality, and again, like you said, not everybody tries to go there, but they find themselves there, is that it keeps me from having to experience failure. Because what if I try? What if I don't have these reasons for staying here and I have to try or I can try and then it doesn't work out the way that I want it to?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I'm a victim and I just can't do it, then I don't have to try and potentially fail, which also means I'll never potentially succeed, though, too.
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense because then it makes it actually kind of an easy out and a bit of an excuse because part of us might like hard work a little bit, but most of us, our natural response, I think, is like, I'd rather not work. I'd rather have someone else do it for
Hmm.
me. And then, the other piece that I really have seen is that because of that attention, like we all love attention. We love love. Like we need
Hmm.
love. And so if that's how we've learned, like, our family dynamics or whatever, we've learned
Oh, honey, you
exactly,
poor
right?
thing. And we don't know how to get that any other way. Then we'll
Exactly.
seek that out.
Then we're going to
Yeah.
seek that out because
Hmm.
that's what we've learned will get us the attention and the love that we need.
Yeah, the
So,
direct path there.
yeah.
So, okay. So why does it matter knowing these things and stuff like that? What are we going to get out of this at the end?
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, even though there can be some individual initial, maybe quote unquote benefit, secondary gain, the broader outcomes for having that victim mentality are actually quite negative.
Hmm.
So what studies have shown is when people have that victim mentality, that they have higher rates of depression and anxiety, more difficulty managing stress levels,
Hmm.
and just being less successful in life, being less able to persevere through challenges and difficulties.
It's almost like taking on a handicap that you never had to have.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And so there is a huge downside for having this mentality because it essentially paralyzes people.
Hmm. And that's, I think, as a therapist, that's one of the hardest things to watch is when somebody, you just initially look at them and you're like, wow, they're attractive, or wow, they seem to be, of a stature that could handle all kinds of things. But then you hear how they talk about their circumstances and their life, and you realize, wow, like, I anticipated that they would have so much more or be much more in life, but that mental victim mentality, redundant, but that mentality of being a victim is actually holding them back.
Yes.
And I never would have guessed.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really puts a ceiling on people's ability to grow and change where they could have been so much more. And the good news is, if people are willing to identify this and see this and say, okay, I don't want to allow myself to have that ceiling anymore. The sky's the
Mm-hmm.
limit, and I think it's exciting.
You just said something, and we didn't talk about talking about this, but when you said ceiling, do you think even like politically sometimes certain things we make ourselves a victim maybe when there isn't another perpetrator out there and stuff, and so we're constantly like fighting back and forth because we think we're a victim of somebody else and stuff when maybe they aren't perpetrating in the first place?
Yeah, I think that definitely can happen, and so that's why we have to be very careful, even in just assuming people's motives and kind of being in that mentality of like, oh, I'm being attacked and people are against me. It's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
are we really? Because that can totally put us in this mental position to get in the defensive, to get in this victim mentality, and that.
Yeah, so it's kind of like we're projecting that onto people without maybe them even intending to do anything
Yeah.
to
So
us
we
and
have to
stuff.
be very careful with that. The whole thing that we're talking about of some of the outcomes of being more in a victim mentality and kind of the negative aspect of that versus the opposite reminds me of this one study that was actually done uh, in the Illinois Bell Telephone Company.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was a study that was actually done on stress and basically the impact of stress, and it was started all the way back in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really interesting because 1975 was before the Telecommunications Competition and Deregulation Act was passed by Congress in 1981.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, this act that was passed by Congress made it so that now suddenly the Illinois Bell Telephone Company had all this competition. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that was terrible for the company. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so within 1 year, half of the workforce was laid off.
Wow.
And so they were following these people and watching the impact of stress on their lives. And what was really interesting is that a lot of the people like really crashed and burned and struggled, but then there was other people that actually thrived
And
after
these are all the people that were laid
that were
off.
laid off.
And
Exactly.
so half of those crashed and burned, and the other ones were doing really
thriving
well.
and doing really well.
Mhm.
And they're like, what's the difference? And they looked at their mentality. And the mentality was basically that victim versus victor mentality. The ones that thrived had what they coined hardiness.
Mm-hmm.
Hardiness.
Resiliency.
Yeah. And hardiness that they defined as the courage to grow from stress,
Mm-hmm.
the courage to grow from difficulty and say, okay, I believe I can grow and
Mhm.
not only persevere, but actually become a better person through all of this.
That's awesome. Yeah. We all should want that for ourselves. And I'm sure it even created even more potential for the ones who had that, hardiness to go looking for other jobs, maybe even get better ones versus what happens when you think you're a victim is you don't even try.
That's right.
So, the outcomes were even greater for those who thought they could handle it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. And it shows that, sometimes when we go through hard circumstances that even though we think, oh boy, maybe this could destroy me, if we have the right attitude facing it, it can actually become a helper, not a hindrance.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things I've noticed even in my clients, how they've handled the pandemic is some people, they slept more, they watched more Hulu or Netflix and stuff and just sort of gave up in the midst of it. Whereas I've noticed other people, they're like, hey, I didn't realize spending all this time with my kids would be fun, or I've decided to continue to homeschool my kids because it actually was a bonding experience versus the other parents are like, get me out of here, hurry,
Right.
get them back to school. I don't know what I'm doing. But the ones who appreciate it kept, adjusting until they found the right, thing for them. Versus some people got healthier and got more fit because they had more time at home. They didn't have the, the transition of going to work versus coming home. They could just take that hour in the middle of the day to exercise or something like that. So they were looking for those things.
That's right.
So it seems like even being a victor makes you more creative.
That's right. And other people gained the COVID-19, as they say, right?
Yes.
And that's the other side of that coin.
Not the freshman 15,
Yes.
but the COVID-19.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So what are 3 ways? This is kind of a funny question, but what are 3 ways we foster victim mentality?
Yeah. And I think it's an important question because when we want to, of course, end with how can we foster that victor mentality, but it's also important to know what are some potential pitfalls that we can foster that victim mentality, because there's real specific things that can do this. And one simple one, and these 3 things aren't going to, encompass all the ways we can foster the victim, but
you're not going to give me everything.
Yeah, we're not going to give you everything, but some general principles so you can kind of know what to look out for. But one is simply watching too much news media. And I'll tell you why. It's been amazing over the last several years. I've noticed such a strong trend for those people that watch a lot of news media. They really struggle, and it almost becomes like a bit PTSD-ish, like a little traumatic, because there's all this stuff that they're watching that's terrible that's going on, but how much can they really do about making a big difference, a big change? I mean, and I'm not saying we should be completely oblivious to what's going on the world stage. And certainly we want to make...
You won't be oblivious.
Right.
So somebody will tell you, even if you're not
Exactly. I have
looking
lots
for
of news
it.
reporters coming to my office every day in the form, in the disguise of patience, telling me what's going on.
Did you see this?
Right. Exactly. But the point being, we're inundated with all this negativity. We can't do very, very much with it.
Passive stress, we call it.
Yeah. And so it puts us in this mentality of like, all this horrible stuff is happening. I can't do anything about it. What is that? That is the victim mentality.
It is, yeah. Except you can go online and tell them what you think of the story they just told you about. Which I'm like,
true.
I'm not an expert in this. Why do you want my opinion?
And then it ends up being inflammatory and actually just making you feel worse because then someone else has a different opinion and nothing changes in the end.
Yeah,
right?
2 groups just get further and further apart in their thinking. So anything else
so
to
2 more
foster the
things.
victim?
Secondly would be really reflecting frequently on the way people have hurt you in the past. Reflecting on...
But they really have hurt me.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, oftentimes we've been very wounded, but how much good does it do to keep reliving that pain, and certainly I'm not saying we shouldn't go through the process of forgiveness. We should, and we need to face that pain and deal with it and process through it, but continuing to talk about it over and over again and almost wearing it as a badge on our shirt sometimes of the wounds we've received. Like, this is my Purple Heart because I was whatever, and certainly, again, I'm not trying to say it's a horrible thing when people are abused and misused and all of this, but we need to be so careful not to just relive that over and over again. It's like
watching the film over and over again of what happened. There's a quote that I love that I have to share. And the quote is, "You can be given a cactus, but you don't have to sit on it."
Yeah. That is a good quote.
And I don't want to sit on my cactuses.
Right.
I want to acknowledge them, maybe even remember them so I don't go back to the places that have hurt me, but I don't want to keep reliving them. And sometimes that's hard if you do have PTSD if you have flashbacks and things like that. But if you have the option to, redirect your thinking or to talk to somebody or, even distract yourself with something healthy at that moment, that's a much better thing than just letting yourself dwell on it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
and
number 3.
The third one is refusal to look in the mirror. It's so easy for us to, like, when bad things are happening in our life, to really look outside of ourselves and want to blame our spouse, our kids, our dog. He ate my homework again.
Yeah.
And, whatever it might be, or our boss. And maybe the problem really lies in us. Maybe it's because the way that we have a hard time getting along with other people, and we're just really snappy and reactive, or maybe it's because we haven't developed a good way of actually time managing, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be willing on an ongoing basis to self-reflect, and even to get feedback from people that we trust and say, hey, this is the problems that I'm running into. And it seems like I keep repeating, do you have any thoughts about why? I mean, am I doing something wrong here? And ask that honestly, not just because you want to.
And be safe enough to
Right.
hear it too
Yeah.
when they tell you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that refusal for us to look in the mirror can definitely foster that victim mentality.
Okay, so we're both sure there are other things that you can do, but how can we foster a victor mentality instead?
Okay, so this is the fun part, because there are some really cool things that we can do to foster that victor mentality.
Don't be a victim.
Yes.
Don't be a victim.
I'll take responsibility
Yes.
for that. And the first one is actually realizing our responsibility. And that's kind of a play on words, right? And Stephen Covey, he used that, and he coined that term responsibility. In other words, our ability to respond,
Mm-hmm.
even though things do happen to us that are completely out of our control, that we have the ability to respond in a different way, a way that makes a difference. And sure, we can't control, like, maybe the way that people are treating us, or maybe a fire that happens in our neighborhood, or whatever it might be, something terrible, maybe even someone coming wanting to beat us up or something like that. But we can definitely control how we respond.
So that seems to suggest that I have choices.
Exactly.
No matter what situation I'm in, there's always going to be a choice of how I respond to that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And no matter how bad it is. I mean, it reminds me, Viktor Frankl, he was a Jewish
Appropriately
psychiatrist.
named.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Viktor Frankl. I never even put that together.
I didn't either until just now.
Viktor Frankl. He was a Jewish psychiatrist that was put in a concentration camp. And he fostered this idea. He was one of the first that he said, because before then there was a big school of thought, like it was like stimulus and response. In other words, if there's a certain stimulus, then you're going to respond a certain way. But he said, no, between stimulus and response lies a space. And in that space lies our choice. And in that choice is our freedom. So in other words, even if people are using us, trying to use us, abuse us, we can still maintain our dignity, our respect. We can respond in a healthy way.
Yeah. It reminds me of my grandfather. Growing up, I would hear stories of him in a Japanese internment camp in China, and how there was this dichotomy between how he responded to it versus how some of the other men in his camp, because they separated the men and women where he was. And he said, he was trying to like trade his shaving kit for a mosquito net so he wouldn't be bothered by the mosquitoes. But meanwhile, there'd be like some of the guys would come in, lay down on their bunks, turn over, and they never got up. Like they literally died in that spot.
Really?
And I just the stories of how my grandfather and other of the men that were around him were, like planning and strategizing and different things that they were doing. And I realized, like, I don't want to be those guys in the bunk that just roll over and give up and stuff. My grandpa made it out alive, and it was hard, but he made it out alive. And I don't want to.
So much was his mentality, right?
It was his mentality and the way he thought. And I always admired that about him, is how, he just had this savviness to him he seemed so gentle, and he's kind of a small man, but like if you ever saw his harder side, you're like, oh, okay.
I think you have a little bit of that in you, Amanda.
I hope so. But it was amazing to hear the stories that he went through, and that he never talked about them in terms of like what happened to him, but it was always like, yeah, and so we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, and
Wow.
and it was almost like I don't think anybody else telling that story would have told it the same way, but I'm just thinking about that as
Yeah,
we talk
no,
about it.
absolutely. That's super neat. And I think that brings me to the second point
Mhm.
of fostering the victor mentality, which is what I'd like to call plot twist.
Yeah.
And really that again, okay, so this is happening, but a lot of it has to do with how am I thinking about what's happening to me so that I can respond and even see the silver lining, see the
Mhm.
potential for growth, and see how I can really make lemonade out of lemons.
Mhm. And we all want an exciting story. Nobody wants to, I mean, maybe you don't want a story written about you, but if you did, you'd hate for it to just be a boring, she woke up this morning and then went back to bed later on. We want the story that has the plot twist. Those are the stories we like to read to see how people respond to them. There's something that inside of each of one of us, we want to think like, I could do that maybe if I was in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the really cool thing is there is even types of therapy, and we call it cognitive behavioral
Mhm.
therapy, that really fosters this sort of thinking, right? Reframing it and saying, okay, we can reframe things in a more positive way, and we can behave in this way, and really think about it this way, so that good things actually can come out of
Mhm.
this difficult situation.
And that has to do with choice too. I have a choice as to believe this about the situation, or I could believe this, or maybe even believe this, or believe that. And there's limitless ways that I can think about the situation. So
Absolutely.
cool.
Uh,
Number 3.
All right. So the final way to help foster a victor mentality is actually healthy spirituality, a
Mm-hmm.
connection with God. Because again, there are so many things that are outside of our control. But if we know somebody that can intervene and can control everything, that really can put our mind and our heart at rest, and
Mm-hmm.
and realizing like, okay, I don't maybe see I definitely don't see the big picture, but if I trust that God does, and I know that He has good in mind for me,
Mm-hmm.
then even what I see right now and maybe I'm upset about, I know in the end can work out in a positive way.
Yeah, I'm reading through the story of Joseph right now. That's my favorite story in the Bible, I think. But just watching how many times he was kicked down and mistreated and everything. And it doesn't tell you so much what he thought in the situation, but you see the outcome of it and you can't help but think, well, he must have been thinking, positive growth kinds of thoughts, victor mentality versus victim mentality.
Absolutely. And I love what he says to his brothers in the end, right?
Oh, I'm going to get chills.
I
I
know I
love
get
this quote.
goosebumps when I think about it. He says, what you meant for evil,
Mhm.
God
Meant
meant
for
for
good.
good.
Yeah.
And when we see, those sorts of stories like Joseph, even like Viktor Frankl, like your
Mhm.
grandpa, for example, it's like, yeah, there is an enemy. There is
Mhm.
evil out there. There is a devil who is trying to destroy God's
Mhm.
children and trying to like hold us down and make us suffer and all of this. But even out of the difficulties, out of the suffering, out of the hardship, God can and He will bring good if we continue to
Mhm.
trust that He has a plan. We continue to hang on to Him. There were months, there were years in Joseph's life where he was probably like, I don't know where this is going, but you know what? I'm
13 years of
right.
ups and downs.
But I'm going to
Yeah.
choose to keep trusting that God has a
Mhm.
plan, and whatever happens, I'm going to remain faithful to Him. And, in the end, God's plan was beautiful, and it was preparing him for a great work to really
Mhm.
not only for his own life, but to rescue his whole family.
Yeah, and how powerful that all of that stuff together, all of the bad stuff that he went through. I always think like he was a Hebrew or an Israelite in the midst of an Egyptian country. That's like, and he was second in command. That's like us pulling somebody out of another country who has been like a slave and putting them up to vice president.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah, pretty cool. Well, that's a good time to wrap up and everything. Hopefully, we're all going to be victors after this. Well, we can all be victors. So, I want to thank you for watching or listening, however you came upon us. And we'll send you off with that. Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.